What happens when a government becomes convinced that the human mind can be broken, reprogrammed, and weaponized, and then decides to find out if that belief is correct by conducting experiments on people who do not know they are being experimented on? Between the early 1950s and the early 1970s, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States conducted a network of secret experiments on human subjects involving psychoactive drugs, sensory deprivation, electroshock, hypnosis, and psychological abuse, much of it without the knowledge or consent of the people involved. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
Mkultra is often treated as a conspiracy theory, which is ironic, because it is one of the most thoroughly documented conspiracies in modern history. It was real, it was official, and when the documentation was eventually exposed, much of it had already been deliberately destroyed. Tonight, we turn to a program that represents one of the clearest documented examples of what happens when fear, secrecy, and unchecked institutional power converge, and when the people conducting the experiments convince themselves that the stakes are high enough to justify anything. The question is not whether Mkultra happened, because it did. The question is how it happened, who made it possible, and what it tells us about the conditions under which institutions abandon the ethical commitments they publicly claim to hold.
Mkultra was not a single experiment or a single program. It was a network of over 100 sub-projects, conducted across universities, hospitals, prisons, and covert facilities across the United States and Canada, funded secretly through front organizations and involving hundreds of researchers, many of whom did not know the full scope of what they were participating in.
We are speaking about Mkultra, the CIA's program of mind control research, conducted from approximately 1953 to 1973, one of the most ethically disturbing operations in the history of the American government.
Its exposure in the 1970s through congressional investigation transformed it from a classified program into a public scandal. But because the CIA had ordered the destruction of most of its records in 1973, the full picture was never recovered. The gaps in the record are themselves part of the story.
Then let us begin with the fear that made Mkultra possible, because without that fear the program would not have been authorized.
The early Cold War was a period of genuine existential anxiety in the American national security establishment. The Soviet Union had acquired nuclear weapons. China had undergone a communist revolution. The Korean War had produced a phenomenon that deeply alarmed Western intelligence. American prisoners of war, who appeared to have been psychologically broken and ideologically transformed by their captors. Some made public statements condemning American policy in terms that their families and colleagues found unrecognizable. The word brainwashing entered the American vocabulary in the early 1950s to describe what appeared to be happening to these prisoners. CIA Director Alan Dulles and others in the intelligence community became convinced that the Soviet Union and China had developed techniques for fundamentally altering human consciousness, breaking down a person's identity and implanting new beliefs and loyalties. If this was true, they believed the United States needed to understand these techniques and develop countermeasures and potentially offensive capabilities of its own.
So the program was justified from the beginning as a defensive response to an enemy capability that was believed to exist.
Yes. And here is the first thing we need to correct about the standard account. Mkultra is sometimes presented as the work of a small group of rogue scientists operating outside the knowledge of CIA leadership. The historical record shows the opposite. The program was authorized by Alan Dulles himself in 1953 and was supervised at the highest levels of the agency. It was not a rogue operation. It was an official program with official authorization, official funding, and official oversight, all of which makes the ethical failures it represents considerably more disturbing than if it had been a rogue effort. The man who directed Mkultra from 1953 was Sidney Gottlieb, a CIA chemist with a doctorate from California Institute of Technology. Gottlieb was personally unusual. He kept goats on his farm in rural Virginia, practiced folk dancing, and held deeply unconventional personal values. He was also a man capable of extraordinary ruthlessness when he believed national security demanded it. He traveled with poison, assassination. The experiments conducted under Mkultra spanned an extraordinary range of methods. LSD, lysergic acid, dithylamide, was the most extensively used substance, having attracted CIA interest because it appeared to produce dramatic alterations in consciousness at extremely small doses. The agency obtained large quantities and administered it to subjects including prisoners, psychiatric patients, and eventually its own operatives, frequently without their knowledge or consent.
So the program was using a powerful psychoactive substance on people who had not agreed to take it.
Yes, the theory was that LSD might be usable as a truth serum, or as a means of breaking down psychological resistance, and making subjects more susceptible to suggestion. The evidence that it worked for these purposes was always weak, and the evidence that it caused severe psychological harm in some subjects was considerable. Neither consideration appears to have significantly altered the program's direction. Other methods included sensory deprivation, in which subjects were isolated from all external stimulation for extended periods, sleep deprivation, electroshock therapy applied at intensities and frequencies well beyond therapeutic use, hypnosis, and psychological manipulation techniques including threat, disorientation, and the systematic destruction of a subject's sense of identity. Some subprojects explored the use of other psychoactive substances, including mescaline, barbiturates, and combinations of multiple drugs. The subjects of these experiments came predominantly from populations with limited power to resist. Prisoners were offered reduced sentences in exchange for participation, a form of coercion that cannot be considered genuine consent. Psychiatric patients in hospital settings were subjected to experiments without any consent at all. Their vulnerability exploited precisely because it made them available and unlikely to be believed if they reported what had happened. Unwitting civilians, including the customers of brothels set up by the CIA in San Francisco and New York for the purpose, were dosed without any knowledge of what they were being given.
So the program systematically targeted people who lacked the social power to resist or report what was being done to them too.
Yes. Operation Midnight Climax was one of the more extensively documented subprojects. CIA operatives set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York where men were brought by women working with the agency, and then given drinks laced with LSD. Operatives observed the subjects through one-way mirrors documenting their reactions. The operation ran through much of the 1950s and into the early 1960s. The men who were drugged were given no information about what had happened to them, had no recourse, and were never informed. The death of Frank Olson in November 1953 is the case most directly associated with Mkultra in public memory. Olson was a bacteriologist working for the United States Army Biological Warfare Laboratories who was involved in aspects of the broader program. At a meeting at a retreat in Maryland, he and other officials were given cocktails that had been secretly dosed with LSD by Gottlieb. Without their knowledge, Olson had a severe adverse psychological reaction. 9 days later, he fell from a window of the Hotel Statler in New York and was killed.
So a man was given a powerful psychoactive substance without his knowledge and subsequently lost his life.
Yes, the official explanation was suicide. His family was told he had jumped. Years later, when Mkultra was exposed, the CIA acknowledged the LSD dosing, and the family received a settlement. A subsequent investigation by Olson's son and by journalists raised serious questions about whether his death was in fact a result of being pushed, rather than a jump, because of fears about what he might reveal. An exhumation and forensic examination in 1994 found evidence consistent with a blow to the head before the fall. No definitive conclusion has been established by legal proceedings. The role of academic and medical institutions in Mkultra deserves specific attention. Many of the subprojects were conducted through legitimate universities and hospitals, whose researchers received CIA funding through front organizations without knowing its source. Others knew the source and accepted the funding anyway. The involvement of prestigious institutions lent the program scientific legitimacy it would not otherwise have had and provided cover that made it difficult to investigate. The list of institutions that participated, when partially reconstructed from the surviving records, included some of the most respected names in American research medicine.
So the scientific credibility of the program was borrowed from institutions that did not fully know what they were lending it to.
Yes. The psychiatrist Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal conducted some of the most extreme ultra-funded experiments, including a technique he called psychic driving, in which subjects were kept in prolonged drug-induced sleep, subjected to electroshock at many times the usual therapeutic intensity, and forced to listen to repeated, recorded messages designed to destroy and replace their existing personalities. Dozens of patients, many of whom had come to the Institute for treatment of relatively minor conditions, suffered severe and lasting harm. Cameron received funding from both the CIA and the Canadian government. The attempt to weaponize LSD also had an ironic cultural after-effect. Some of the LSD that circulated in American counterculture in the 1960s and that became central to the psychedelic movement, entered circulation through pathways connected to Mkultra research. Ken Kesey, whose novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was set in a psychiatric hospital, and who became a central figure in the 1960s psychedelic scene, first encountered LSD as a paid volunteer in a government-sponsored drug study at a Veterans Administration hospital in California. The CIA-funded experiments they were trying to contain contributed to the cultural transformation they feared.
So a program designed to control consciousness accidentally helped liberate it, at least in the cultural sense?
Yes, and this unintended consequence is characteristic of the program more broadly. The results of the Mkultra experiments consistently failed to demonstrate that any of the hoped-for objectives, a reliable truth serum, a method of implanting beliefs, a technique for creating programmed operatives, were achievable. The human mind proved considerably more resistant to manipulation than the program's architects had hoped. The experiments caused serious harm in pursuit of goals that were not reached. The brainwashing fear that motivated the program was itself largely based on a misreading of what had happened to American prisoners in Korea. Later analysis by psychologists and historians concluded that the behavioral changes observed in some returned prisoners were better explained by standard coercive techniques, including isolation, sleep deprivation, physical stress and social pressure, than by any sophisticated new technology of mind control. The Soviets and Chinese did not have secret methods of rewriting consciousness. They had methods that exploited the ordinary vulnerabilities of human beings under sustained duress.
So, the entire program was built on a fear that was substantially exaggerated.
Yes, the enemies had no magic. The belief that they did drove a program that caused real harm to real people, violated the ethical commitments of the institutions that conducted it, and permanently damaged the relationship between the American government and its own citizens. The fear was not entirely fabricated, but the response it generated was massively disproportionate to what the evidence actually supported, and the people who made the decisions either did not know this or did not want to all.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand the people who ran Mkultra and the choices they made, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Poisoner-in-Chief by Stephen Kinzer.
So this is a biography of Sidney Gottlieb that places Mkultra within the specific human choices that drove it ill.
Kinzer investigates the life of Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA chemist, who led the program, providing a detailed account of the experiments, the motivations behind them, and the ethical implications of attempting to control the human mind during the Cold War. The book situates Mkultra within the broader intelligence culture of the period rather than presenting it as an isolated aberration.
Is it accessible to readers without a background in intelligence history?
Kinzer writes as a journalist and former New York Times correspondent, which means the book is narrative-driven and builds its own context carefully. No prior knowledge of CIA history is required. The book is particularly effective at making Sidney Gottlieb comprehensible as a human being, which is important because understanding how people with genuine complexity and even genuine personal virtues can authorize monstrous things is the real lesson of Mkultra.
So it gives the reader the human interior of the program, rather than only its documented exterior.
Precisely. And Kinzer does not reduce Gottlieb to a cartoon villain, which would be comforting, but inaccurate. He presents someone who believed deeply in what he was doing, and whose convictions were shaped by a specific historical moment in ways that make the ethical failures more understandable and more alarming than simple villainy would be.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
Mkultra was exposed in the mid-1970s through two separate investigations. The Rockefeller Commission, appointed by President Ford to investigate CIA domestic activities, touched on aspects of the program in 1975. The Church Committee, the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, investigated more extensively the same year. The investigations were triggered in part by the discovery of a cache of financial records that had escaped the destruction order because they had been misfiled in a records center rather than at CIA headquarters. The CIA Director Richard Helms had ordered the destruction of all Mkultra files in January of 1973, shortly before he left office, apparently in anticipation of congressional scrutiny. The destruction was carried out. The surviving financial records, discovered by accident, provided the documentary basis for the subsequent investigation, but they represented only a fragment of what had existed. The full scope of the program, the identities of all subjects, the complete range of experiments, and the full extent of harms caused can no longer be reconstructed.
So the destruction of records is itself a crime, whose consequences include the permanent inability to fully account for the program's victims.
Yes, Sidney Gottlieb retired from the CIA in 1973, the same year the records were destroyed. He was never prosecuted. He settled eventually in rural Virginia, worked as a volunteer in a hospice, and passed away in 1999. He gave no comprehensive public account of his work. What he said about Mkultra in the limited interviews he gave was that he had acted in good faith in a different time with different understandings of what was necessary. The long-term consequences of Mkultra's exposure were significant for public trust in American institutions. The program's existence confirmed the suspicion, widespread in the post-Vietnam and post-Watergate era, that the government had systematically deceived the public and operated outside the law in the name of national security. It contributed to a lasting skepticism about official accounts of classified programs that has never fully resolved.
So Mkultra did not only harm its direct victims, it damaged the trust that makes democratic governance function.
Yes, and this erosion of trust has had complex effects. On one hand, it has produced legitimate and healthy skepticism about government claims of necessity and legality. On the other hand, it has fueled a broader culture of conspiracy thinking in which the documented reality of Mkultra is used to lend credibility to claims that are entirely undocumented. The irony is that the existence of a genuine government conspiracy makes it more difficult to distinguish between well-evidenced claims of institutional wrongdoing and unfounded speculation. The ethical questions raised by Mkultra extend beyond the specific program. The experiments violated the principle of informed consent that had been articulated in the Nuremberg Code of 1947, developed in response to the medical experiments conducted by Nazi physicians in the Second World War. The irony that American intelligence was conducting non-consensual human experiments at almost exactly the same time that American prosecutors were arguing at Nuremberg that such experiments constituted crimes against humanity was not, it appears, a source of significant discomfort to those who authorized Mkultra.
So the program violated ethical standards that the United States had itself helped establish and prosecute others for violating.
Yes, and this gap between stated principles and actual conduct is one of the most important lessons Mkultra offers. The people who authorized the program were not ignorant of ethical principles. They had access to the Nuremberg Code. They understood the concept of informed consent. They chose to set it aside because they believed the security situation justified the exception. This is the standard mechanism by which ethical frameworks are abandoned, not through ignorance but through the conviction that the current situation is exceptional enough to justify departing from them. The modern relevance of Mkultra is not primarily historical. It is structural. The conditions that produced it, a combination of genuine security threat, institutional secrecy, concentrated power, inadequate oversight, and the willingness of capable and educated people to convince themselves that the ends justified extreme means are not historically unique. They are conditions that can recur whenever secrecy, fear, and institutional pressure combine in a context of insufficient accountability.
So Mkultra is not only a warning from the past, it is a description of a recurring structural risk.
Yes, the debates that Mkultra makes vivid about the limits of what governments can do in the name of security, about the necessity of genuine oversight for classified programs, about the protection of vulnerable populations from institutional power, and about the conditions under which ethical commitments collapse, are not debates that have been resolved. They continue in different forms every time a government claims that a particular threat justifies methods that would otherwise be prohibited. What makes Mkultra uniquely valuable as a case study is the combination of documentary evidence and deliberate destruction. The records that survived show what was done. The records that were destroyed remind us that we do not have the full picture. Both facts are important. The partial record we have is disturbing enough. The unknown remainder is a standing reminder that institutional secrecy, without adequate accountability, produces outcomes that the institutions themselves recognize cannot be defended in the open.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the fear that authorized the program, the experiments that no one consented to, the records that were destroyed, and the questions that remain unanswered.
Mkultra reminds us that the most dangerous moment in any institution is not when bad people do bad things, But when good people convince themselves that the situation is exceptional enough to justify setting aside the side principles that define what they are.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.